Welcome to this Fox 9 Voices for Change special, Closing the Racial Wealth Gap. I'm Dawn Stevens. During the next 30 minutes, we'll talk with local experts to understand why the wealth gap exists and the solutions needed to close it. Also, what action all of us can take today to do our part. The racial wealth gap between blacks and whites is projected to take 228 years to bridge, according to research from the University of St. Thomas. Identifying the challenges and facing the reality of contributing factors is the first step towards addressing the issue. Scholars and economists have identified many contributing factors to the wealth gap: disparities in education, home ownership, criminal justice, and lack of access to jobs. We start this crucial conversation talking to Professor of Law Artika Tyner at St. Thomas. Her research on the racial wealth gap gives us insight into the history and why the problem exists in Minnesota. Artika, when we look at the state of Minnesota, it's interesting, you describe it as the tale of two cities. Why is that?
It's because when we look at the data, Minnesota is ranked as one of the best places to live, quality of life, even one of the happiest places based upon one of the surveys. And when we look at that, that's a reality for most. The majority of Minnesotans experience that piece of hope and a vibrant economy, but yet for many others, Minnesota has become a nightmare because of the disparities that they experience in every quality of life indicator in their day-to-day life.
Obviously, there's been a lot of research done about the areas where the greatest disparities exist. And in our state, some of the most glaring areas are four different ones that we want to talk about today. First, let's start with education. Everybody has seen the billboard talking about the achievement gap, but there is a history of disparity in education here in Minnesota.
This history is rooted in a number of things. But first, we want to think about access to a quality of education. And oftentimes we start in K through 12, but we know many of the disparities that we see is in kindergarten readiness and that early childhood education. So if we make that investment early on, we can help then to put all students on that pathway to access to equal success in education.
Second, this is a big one, and one of the most disturbing because I've heard so many statistics on it lately when it comes to home ownership and how many people of color and blacks own their home compared to how many whites own their home. And that really plays a part in the disparity, doesn't it?
It does. The data shows us that there's for home ownership, and primarily most of the data is covering the Twin Cities metro area, that the data is that for black home ownership between 17 to 25%. When we look at the white population, it's nearly double or triple, depending on which research study you're looking at. And we know that home ownership is that bedrock, that foundation of intergenerational wealth. So until we make sure that we also have equality there and create opportunities for that first home buyer, we then create those opportunities to build families and safe communities.
There have been many stories done about 94 going through that and impacting home ownership by blacks, and also in South Minneapolis. Talk about the history.
So being a daughter of Rondo, 5 generations of my family have lived on that sacred ground. One of the things that we know for sure is that what made Rondo so vibrant is that it was an economic hub with home ownership, with strong schools, and with a strong economic engine through the work of having over 400 black-owned businesses. So when we look at that, we know that when you invest in community, when you give access to opportunities, that you can create change. And by losing our homes with the interstate highways coming through in the mid-1950s, and it's not just Rondo, it's not just South Minneapolis, there are over 1,000 cases of documented racial removal across the United States and its impact in real time of displacement and loss of that possibility of intergenerational wealth.
The third area of disparity is the criminal justice system. You really have done a lot of research in that area. What do we know about the history of that disparity and what it looks like now even?
Well, we know today what we call mass incarceration was impacted directly by the war on drugs. And we also know that that disproportionately impacted communities of color and African American community in particular. So we know then that there were more African American men potentially that enter into the prison gates during the war on drugs and still yet today than who were enslaved during the 1800s. If we're investing in the future, and let's just make it very specific about Minnesota, if we're investing roughly about $40,000 a year to incarcerate someone and between $10,000 to $15,000 to educate someone, I think we have to think about where our investments are. And I want to invest in the future. I want to invest in hope.
The fourth area of disparity is lack of access to jobs for African Americans.
So when we think about jobs and our data that we can see from DEED, especially at the peak of the pandemic, we see that African Americans had some of the highest rates of unemployment. Why did that happen? Primarily because African Americans tend to be in low wage opportunities, and they tended to also be frontline staff members. So why are we not then investing in those vocational opportunities to retool, for instance, in STEM? If the STEM careers are growing at a rate faster than all careers, 2 to 3 times combined, let's invest more in education. Let's invest more in innovation, because we'll all win.
You can learn more about Dr. Tyner's research and her work in the community at artikatyner.com. Now to more on the labor gap. Since COVID, experts say a whole new world of opportunities have opened up. Next, we sit down with Lewis King, who has been the CEO of Summit Academy OIC in Minneapolis for decades. He was recently named the CEO of OIC of America, a nonprofit organization providing education and training services to those with low incomes or those who are unemployed. Lewis King has decades of experience in education, youth development, and workforce development. We jump into this conversation during discussing one of Minnesota's biggest challenges, the lack of a stable middle-class Black community.
All of your middle class here is imported. They come to work for the Fortune 5s, which deprives the African American community of their social capital. A, they don't live in the community. This doesn't make them bad people. It's just a fact. B, when their assignment is up, they leave. The young ones who come and work for the Fortune 5s can't find a social life, so they leave. Well, what's left? Those who are in dire straits, hence the disparities. And without a strong Black middle class, you will continue to have the phenomena of a leading economy with the widest disparities in the nation. Everything else is a Band-Aid.
That is so interesting. There are 3 things that you say need to happen to be able to close this racial wealth gap. The first thing you talk about is educating our people.
Education is key. Why do you think it was a crime to learn to read? It levels the playing field. Somebody else needs to teach algebra and reading and composition and all the fundamentals so that our children are ready to go.
Second, and this is a big one, you say train them to get those important skills.
You must have something that the marketplace demands and respects, period. Supply and demand. You gotta have a skill that you trade across the table. And in this town, we breed activists. We don't breed entrepreneurs and business people and educators because of the conditions. They're in a state of fighting. But the skills, construction, the built up area, technology, the demands, healthcare, all of these things are right in front of us, communications. And you gotta figure out what is it that is your passion and that you're good at, and somebody's gotta point you in that direction. And then we take the children and we put them on the track like raising a racehorse, right? And from the time they're 6, just like they know they're gonna be a hockey player, you're gonna be an investment banker. You look like a great chemist.
It starts when they're a kid.
It starts when the NFL, Major League Baseball, hockey, those 16-year-old gymnasts that you see at the Olympics, they didn't just put on tights yesterday. She didn't get on that daredevil doing the no hands flip on the beam, didn't start yesterday, all right? She started at 3 or 4 years of age.
Obviously, you mentioned that technology is so important. It's going to be big for our future. We know that, but what can people, families be thinking about right now as far as taking that path possibly?
You know, the world has changed. Esports, for example, teaching valuable skills go out be a drone operator, a job that didn't exist 15 years ago. We didn't even think about it, right? Now drones are just a part of life, from real estate to surveillance. I mean, weddings, they're everywhere. Drone operators. You just think about that. Kids with joysticks and that, let them play. Let them get into the technology. But at the same time, attach them to something that teaches the skill. The toolkit has changed. And we have to ensure that our children get that new toolkit and they have access to it the same way we did with baseball, football, and basketball.
The third thing we're going to talk about that might be the most important, one of the most important, is we have to connect people socially.
Right. I call it the social network. Tell everybody you know you're looking for a job. And then they'll tell people, and somebody will say, well, I'm looking for this, and that's it. When you think about it, you don't find churches, restaurants, doctors, lawyers, dentists through commercials. You go and you ask people. Even when you do the internet search, you don't know whether to trust it or not. The social network is so powerful. We think that it's only the rich and powerful to use it, the good old boys club or the good old girls club, but it's in every church, it's on every block, it's in every business. The social network is the most powerful social tool that is overlooked and taken for granted, and hence the term privilege.
Louis, do you believe that we can close the racial wealth gap here in Minnesota?
It will happen. It is inevitable.
So why is it inevitable? King says, as long as we recognize the opportunities and step into them, progress will happen. If you're looking for vocational, technology, or construction opportunities, you can visit summitacademyoic.org for more information. According to a recent study, African Americans are rejected for all types of loans at double the rate of their white counterparts. That statistic isn't going unnoticed by one local bank. We sat down with an executive at U.S. Bank to learn about initiatives to bring more financial opportunities to the Black community and the strategy behind new initiatives you'll notice at their banks.
You're watching Fox 9's Voices for Change.
Welcome back to this Voices for Change special on closing the racial wealth gap. U.S. Bank recently conducted Good time to mess up, sorry.
You're watching Fox 9's Voices for Change.
Welcome back to this Voices for Change special on closing the racial wealth gap. U.S. Bank recently conducted research and detailed the results in a report called Build Black Wealth Insights. One statistic shows 80% of Black respondents feel there are still institutional roadblocks impeding their ability to accumulate wealth. Senior Executive Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer Greg Cunningham reveals more of the study and talks solutions. Greg, let's talk about building Black wealth. Now, this is a phrase you shared with me. I think it's so interesting because some of us say financial literacy, but you say, no, let's call it building Black wealth. What exactly does that mean?
You know what I love about the term wealth, Dawn, is because it invites everybody into the conversation about financial health, financial security, and at a very fundamental level, this notion of human dignity. You don't have to have a lot of money to have wealth. Literacy would suggest that that there are people who are illiterate about financial services, and I think that might be true, but I think for the most part, what people are really sort of interested in is how do I build wealth so that I can continue to create health and security for my families and my communities.
And just to be clear, you don't have to already have a lot of perceived wealth or perceived money to be able to build Black wealth.
That's exactly right, Dawn, because what it takes to build wealth is to have a sense of foundational financial security, things like owning your own home, having gainful employment, not only having savings, but being able to invest in the future and having a plan that goes beyond today, but ensuring that you are sort of mapping out a plan for yourselves that allows you to provide for your family and your community in the best way.
Greg, a recent report that you all did, you learned 3 things very interesting. The first one, Black customers really think about their community and they give. Explain that.
You know, this notion of community was a really important insight on, you know, our Black affluent respondents to our survey disproportionately talked about the importance of community. We know historically for Black Americans, when one of us is successful, that's not enough if the rest of the community is still suffering. And so we have this greater sense of responsibility to our community and not just to ourselves. And I think this notion of being able to give back and bring the community with you, none of us are successful if the people around us aren't successful. And I think that's something that's a critical part of our lived experience as Black Americans in this country.
I love that. The second thing you learned, the Black community that's more affluent, they're thinking about generational wealth and how to pass it on.
You know, generational wealth was a really important insight in the study. Not a surprise at all, but, you know, historically, we haven't been able to pass generational wealth from generation to generation, Dawn.
So crucial. So give us some ideas of how we can gain and grow generational wealth.
Number one is we have to have conversations. We have to continue to educate ourselves. We have to understand the difference between being rich and what it means to have wealth, because everybody can have wealth. So having financial education and having conversations about it is number one. Number two is we actually have to seek out professionals. We have a program called Each One, Reach One, where we're actually taking Black bankers in our organization and we're training them to be financial advisors. Because this notion of representation also matters, Dawn, is being able to sit down with someone who shares your lived experience to have conversations about finances and wealth is a critical piece of this. So getting professional help is also important.
Let's talk about this. If it's so important for Blacks to work with Blacks in banking, as you mentioned, and home buying, as you mentioned, how do we build a workforce of people in those industries?
We've got to start much earlier, Dawn, and sort of making the financial services industry a much more attractive proposition for our young people. That means introducing notions of finance and investment earlier in the educational process. We have a partnership with a company called Goal Setter, which is doing exactly that, teaching young kids and families about what it means to not only save, but to also invest. And investment means that you have a plan, you're thinking about the future, and we're not just thinking about today. So we got to start much earlier and make the industry an attractive conversation.
Greg, finally, we have to create a financial ecosystem, don't we?
It's going to take more than just Black banks and large banks, Dawn. It's going to take a whole ecosystem of financial services and resources to help build these vibrant communities. Banks play a really important role in that. But we also know that credit unions and community development financial institutions, which can actually lend and distribute resources in ways that large banks can't do, we have to make sure that we are collaborating and partnering in ensuring that we're creating this entire ecosystem that meets the full range of needs of our community.
Can you see us closing the racial wealth gap?
I'm optimistic, Don, I really am. I think it's going to take an incredible amount of hard work. I think it's going to take a laser-like focus. I think we can't take our eye off the ball, which we have historically done, and move on to other topics when, you know, this work is not easy. And it's often easy to move on to topics that make us feel more comfortable and that are easier to talk about. We're going to have a great deal of stamina and long-term commitment to it. The short answer to it, Don, is yes, we are going to do it, but we're going to do it together.
Many of U.S. Bank's initiatives to address social and economic inequities are well underway, including efforts to increase the number of Black financial advisors over the next 2 years. To learn more, just head to usbank.com/wealth-gap. Coming up this morning, what does it take to go from having nothing to owning property and businesses worth a fortune? To wrap up our Closing the Racial Wealth Gap special, a personal story of determination. What you need to know to become a success yourself.
You're watching Fox 9's Voices for Change.
The road to success is full of challenges. Statistics show it's even more difficult for women of color. We chose to bring you the story of Gloria Freeman because in the late 90s, she was struggling to make ends meet, dealing with a divorce, and still trying to be a mom. Today, she owns several businesses and 2 commercial buildings, but the road to success wasn't easy. Gloria, you are a wonderful example of a success story, going through the struggles, navigating the opportunities. Tell us, at what point did you decide to start your own business?
I got laid off from my job as an underwriter. I had been working as an underwriter for many years, and I felt like I didn't want to go back into the underwriting world, even though it was a successful career, well-paying job. I just didn't feel fulfilled. And at the time, I was married to someone that owned a hair salon, and I thought it would be a great idea to start the first black spa here in the Twin Cities. I don't think my husband was on the same page at the time, and he was not very happy about that, and we ended up separating, and that's the beginning of my success, I guess I could say that.
Someone told you about the healthcare industry, and they were hiring at the time.
Once I got separated from my husband, I completed the esthetician program, tried to work in that field, but as a single parent, it just was not enough income. I was interviewed by Hennepin County, and I ended up getting licensed. And that was the beginning of the start of Olu's Home.
You started with one residential house. What have you grown to now, these many years later?
I started with one rental and in North Minneapolis, and now I own all our residential sites, and there are 11 of them.
What's your advice, and what did you do? You didn't give up to be able to grow like that.
There were difficult times. I mean, there's no doubt about it. I remember the first rental place I opened, before you could get a client, I rented that duplex, got a client. It took a couple months, but I got a client. That client moved out in 3 months.
Uh-oh.
So what am I gonna do now?
Right.
You don't give up. You just don't, that's not an option. I just networked. I happened to meet 2 guys that started an organization called MCCP, and they work with developmental adults that are in crisis that need placement. And that was the beginning of my relationship, my business. And the majority of my clients at the very beginning were very difficult clients that an established provider just would not provide service for.
And you stepped in and said, I'm going to take this on, networking, not giving up, and now you have grown to 2 commercial buildings.
My daughter had just, a couple years before that, had just finished college, and she had majored in child development. And we brainstormed, and we decided to open up an early childhood program that she could run. So I'm a big advocate on real estate, that I think that real estate is the key to wealth, right?
Okay, love it.
And so I bought my first commercial building in North Minneapolis. It's actually the Old City Inc.
Real estate is the key to wealth. I love that. We're going to see your new building in Uptown. Explain what's inside that commercial site.
On 23rd and Hennepin, it's probably the length of a block.
Wow.
And there's 7 commercial spots, and then there's 11 rental apartments upstairs. I wanted to start a new business, and then one of the spaces was empty in that building, And that's where I'm going to start Boutique et Toi. This is for people in the health and beauty industry. I love working with people that are severely mentally ill, developmental disabled. There's nothing more rewarding to know that you're doing something to give real help. I've always been an advocate in the health and beauty industry. It's something that's another love that I have, and that I have this great opportunity to be a part of both.
Gloria, as we wrap this up, you've inspired so many people with your story that you just shared. What is your best advice to people who are in shoes like you were in years ago and just, I want more, I want to do something more? What would you tell them?
Don't give up. Make sure that you're doing something that you really love, because it is hard work. Always remember to network, and when one door closes, another one will open.
Don't give up. Words everyone can live by. Gloria is the Chief Executive Officer of Olu's Home. You can learn more about her businesses by going to olushome.com. Thank you so much for joining us for this Voices for Change special. Head to fox9.com/VFC for more stories on how leaders in our community are making moves to bring positive change for all Minnesotans.